very much for this extensive and kind introduction about my career so far. And thank you very much also for the invitation to speak here at the ISCBacademy Webinar Series for the Bio-Ontologies. What Nuria also already mentioned with yourself as well, with some background in biology, and recently I've been going a little bit more back into the Bio-Ontologies that I started off with Bio-Ontologies in 2004 actually. The work that I will be focusing on in this presentation emanates from a recent paper that Nuria liked me to focus on, which looks at resolving and avoiding design conflict, especially in ontology development, and to some extent also in deployment, and basically the using of ontologies. And a further note here, we'll look first a little bit at some context on and motivation, because what I understood is that there is a mix and a background of people who will be watching this presentation. And then we'll move on to resolving the conflicts. Then it is basically a notion of trade-offs that you have to make, and you have to make these choices. So in that sense, we're looking more at the engineering side of ontology engineering rather than on the fundamental and scientific theoretical side of it, and I will close with some conclusions. So with respect to the context and the motivation, I hope you have heard at least about ontologies. It is, however, difficult to give one nice definition of an ontology. You see here a simplified graphical rendering of a fragment of the gene ontology. The key components, basically what you will see in an ontology, is that you have classes. They may be concept universals or entity types, whatever you want to call them. You have relations between those classes, what you see here on the slide with the arrows. In this case, they are subsumption arrows, is a, such as a primary metabolic process is a metabolic process. There may also be other relations, such as transformation, causality, parthood, and so forth. And an ontology also will have constraints that hold between those entities over those relations. For instance, the spike protein must have exactly 3 subunits to give an idea of a kind of constraint that may be present there. So with those ontologies, you see a pretty picture. If you want to develop one, you'll end up using what is called an ODE, an ontology development environment, and that may be looking probably something like this, what you see here is a screenshot of Protege. Still, it is a graphical rendering, a GUI of it. What you have behind it is basically a text file. So really from a computing point of view, a software engineering viewpoint, you have a text file that is not unstructured text, but a specific structured text that you can computationally use for a variety of purposes. That structured text is actually what is called a serialization of the logic that is behind that ontology, formalize the ontology in a specific logic. And in this case, for this specific ontology, that is AL, which is a serialization, so like an implemented version of some of the description logics that are behind it. We'll not go into description logics for that. Here we're looking more at the engineering and the usage side of it, and the modeling. Sorry. So for the ontologies themselves, you can develop them for their own sake and also for communication among humans. But it is actually used for many different ontology-driven information systems, as largely the people want to have a purpose, not just develop ontology for their own sake, but really to do something with it. Originally, that was database integration that ontologies were proposed for in the 90s. But it's also being used in other areas that saw that, hey, we have this ontology thing, we can use that for our problem too. It can solve our problems too, such as helping with recommender systems, natural language processing, question generation, QA systems, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of different applications there. I think, however, somebody's got to develop those ontologies. And you have to think about, okay, how are we then going to develop the ontologies so that we can get those benefits in ontology-driven information systems? So There are several guidelines being proposed since the late 90s. They are called methodologies, but from a purely information systems perspective viewpoint, on the processual viewpoint, they are largely guidelines because they actually haven't been scientifically evaluated as methodologies would be. But there are, what you could see, commonalities amongst those methodologies to help you develop the ontology. It doesn't matter at the moment much which methodology specifically you use, as long as you use one, because we know that using one of them at least is better than not using one. There are key steps in basically in all of those ones. First, you look at a feasibility study. What is the problem that they actually have, and is an ontology actually helping and contributing to a solution for that? Also the economic feasibility of it, because somebody's got to develop it and it costs quite a few resources. Then with respect to the ontology development process that you see there in the middle, you have a notion of domain analysis. What subject domain are you going to represent in your ontology? You may want to have an intermediate stage with what is called a conceptualization. It's basically drawing, for instance, pictures, or having some structured, quasi semi-structured way of representing it. And then what is called their implementation is basically you're going to formalize it in a specific ontology language for that. In those activities, there are a whole bunch of sub-activities such as ontology reuse, knowledge acquisition, to be able to actually get your ontology developed. And afterwards, you use it with maintenance, extending, for instance, the ontology with the topic that you couldn't cover for your prior versions, for instance. If you look a little bit at this notion of ontology reuse and acquisition, this middle bar there are a whole range of scenarios for that. So here is a sampling of a range of steps and methods that you would use to develop the ontology, such as reusing an ontological resource. It says they're aligning and merging. How do you combine those ontologies? That actually conflicts can emerge when you're trying to do that. So we'll get into that later in the presentation. Likewise, there are non-ontological resources that you have to re-engineer a little bit so that you can get that one and that material or a subset of that material in your ontology to get that to work to populate your ontology. So that is on that component of the actual ontology development. If you take, on the other hand, a broader scope, you can also say, well, look, it's not just sort of like a waterfall sequence that we saw in the previous slide. You actually have a life cycle, or hopefully sort of like a virtuous spiral upwards of a sequence of requirements, development, the analysis, the design, the deployment, and the maintenance. Then an operation generates new requirements to improve, and you have an ever-improving cycle upwards. So that is a different approach of looking at. What we're focusing on here in this presentation is we can't possibly do all of those ones. We're going to go specifically look at this notion of ontology design and ontology development, and a little bit on the system design component of it, because there's only like 45 minutes, 50 minutes time for it. So if you think that there are the cycles, and even though that this is a large cycle, each of those little parts of a pie, you actually can think of that. You could make that in itself also a little life cycle, just for each little component. For instance, if you say, well, look, we're doing our ontology development, you could do, for instance, a method within that for how to get the axioms in the ontology. You could take an engineering approach from software development. There is test-driven development, and from that test-driven development, you could do something similar for the axioms on how to get the knowledge exactly into your ontology, for instance. Which brings me to the question then, okay, how do we get those axioms in the ontology, and what about that? The actual modeling is also sometimes called ontology authoring, and it uses, as opposed to these macro level processes, those information system processes, it uses instead what is also called micro level guidelines. methods and tools specifically that focus and zoom in on one specific axiom and how to get the best axiom into your ontology. For instance, how to get with OntoClean, how to get a good hierarchy on how in your ontology of the classes. Or for instance, with OntoParts, to be able to choose the most appropriate part-whole relation that you would need to improve the ontology's quality to be as precise as you can. And there are further tools to model, reason, debug, to debug, integrate, to link the data, and so on and so forth. But that is all of it if you know what you want to put in your ontology already and you just want to do it well. And the quality of the ontology. In some cases, and sometimes you're actually not quite sure of the ontology, of the axioms that you should put in. Or sometimes you think you know, and then it leads to a conflict. If you have already tried some ontology development, you put something in Protégé and something turns red. That is what you have as an underlying issue is called at least an incoherent ontology. It may also be an inconsistent ontology, which means there is a conflict somewhere and you have to figure out where is the conflict and how are you going to address that. So to give some examples of the kind of conflicts, what do we talk about when we talk about conflicts when you develop an ontology, being it either from scratch or when you integrate and reuse something. You may have heard about the basic formal ontology, especially if you are already in the Bio-Ontologies area. One example is, for instance, the BFO doesn't have stuff. They are indicated in natural language with mass nouns, such as mucus, citrus, soil, and water. And then what are you going to do? Because you would want to represent those kind of things because they happen out there in biology, microbiology, chemistry, and so on. So what are you going to do? What are the options when a foundational ontology, for instance, doesn't give a solution? Are you going to deny the existence of that kind of entity? Are you going to sort of like squeeze something underneath one of those classes that are already in the ontology? Or maybe you can put something from the side, create or reuse a core ontology at the same level somehow for BFO. What are you going to do if there is essentially a theory conflict? Likewise, you can have that not only at a fundamental, foundational level, you can have that also in the applied level, for instance, whether the virus is an organism or an acellular structure. There are different ontologies actually have each of those axioms in there. Also, even if you do know what you want to represent, it may be then still a case of how are you going to encode it. We know, for instance, that a caterpillar transforms into a chrysalis, transforms into a butterfly. But are we going to represent that through a class transformation? Or are we going to link those three entities through relationship transforms? The idea and the reality is the same, but the encoding in our ontology is different. And if for one ontology, that the designers have made one commitment on the way how to encode it, and the other ontology has made another, the other option, you get a conflict if you want to actually link or integrate them. And you have to ask me, how are you going to resolve that, basically? They are not just hypothetical examples. I had with my collaborator, Rolf Grüter, from Switzerland, from BSL in Switzerland. We actually had a real use case for an epizootic disease outbreak where such issues came before. I had to do with avian influenza from a while ago that turned out to be quite relevant. The Swiss authorities set up protection zones within a radius of 3 kilometers, surveillance zones within 10 kilometers, and there were different rules that had to be fired and applied depending on where specifically you were with respect to the epizootic disease outbreak. And they needed to decide which municipalities to include in those zones, which ones to exclude, and what instructions to give. So here is an example of some of this data that they actually had to deal with. You see there are different, the fines, the previous fines, the current fines, the notion of protection and surveillance zones, and the different radii for that. Now you may wonder, that was old data. The Swiss, however, had something like, okay, it is about time that there will be a new infection. And they wanted to make those decisions better and faster for a next time. And we're talking in that sense mid-2019, coincidentally. So what they did was developing two ontologies, one about epidemiological information and the other one about administrative ontology. There was data related to that about the epidemic and about the geo information. There was information in there, such as the municipality in exactly one region, and they wanted to have inferences that the region of the find is contained in the region occupied by the protection zone, that is again contained in the region occupied by the surveillance zone. So they had designed those two ontologies, and then I was like, okay, fine, we have those two, we're going to combine them, and we're going to have our reasoning. What happens is that the reasoner turned out back an error, a pop-up message, something about non-simple, and Rolf was not happy with that, and that it even was saying it's beyond L to the L. So what happened? When he came to me with that problem, it's like, okay, I know where to find the solution, or at least to find the problem, and there are several solution options. And then it was like, okay, but this would perhaps solve this specific individual case. There are always trade-offs. If you remove an axiom here, what you had to remove, then we would lose some of the reasoning of what would be the optional case. This further then motivated looking at, no, actually we should make a more principled approach to that, to this notion, okay, they have these conflicts, what kind of conflicts are there, and how can we resolve that? How can we also provide a modeler with guidelines to be able to resolve those things, rather than, for instance, Rolf asking me even, okay, what should I do and what is the problem for it? So that's what we set out to do. So how do you manage those kind of differences, and how can we manage and resolve those kind of issues? To be able to do so, the details are described further in the paper. To summarize here, basically, is that we identified types of conflicts that can arise. It was not only that one, but we'll see later what actually caused it. But there are a whole bunch of other kind of conflicts that can arise. We need to determine how to preempt those ones, or at least to be able then to detect them if they are happening when you're trying to integrate an ontology. We need a way to be able to assess options, what to do with it when a conflict arises, and how do we come up with the options, and how do we manage those kind of things, and specify a mechanism to keep track of these kind of aspects, so that somebody a year later will still be able to figure out why this design decision was made, rather than looking at, okay, now that's not the decision I would have made, because you have perhaps partial information. And then at the end, obviously, devising a way to make this easier for the ontology developer, both to do as well as to be able to document it, so we have a trail of those kind of decisions being made. So before I continue, there is a difference here that you want to specify, is that there's a distinction between what we call meaning negotiation and conflict resolution. Meaning negotiation in this case concerns the deliberations to figure out what do you really want to represent. And they are all positive choices, knowing, okay, this is what should go into the ontology. Whereas conflict resolution concerns the choosing of one option among a set of two more options, and none of them is actually ideal, or basically the lesser among evils. So it also necessarily involves a compromise. It's a trade-off, and you take the least worst option. And it also involves that what the choice you have made always will involve some re-engineering something, and at least some of the ontology or the system related to it that you're using. There is no way to avoid that, basically. So to give a sample scenario how that then might work out, for instance, in the reuse scenario, you would have one ontology, you want to import the other one, the tool would give a feedback, being able to find where the clash is, basically. You have the algorithms will be able to find which axioms is actually the cause of the conflict. It will be able to propose what are your options. For that, we largely rely on the principle of Occam's razor, as basically the kind of options to fix it, would be the options of minimal effort in most cases, because otherwise the possibilities to resolve it are too many. And we also exclude the option of just delete it from your ontology. We don't want to have that. It's not that we want to avoid it, we want to resolve it, basically. And then you implement the solution. So you may want to wonder then, what are those key sources of conflicts? Where do they actually come from? So when you have a conflict, again, you look at, okay, then what are the typical sources, basically? So one is ontological differences between established theories. For instance, the BFO foundational ontology versus Dolce. There are several others around as well. You have some agreement, but also certain disagreements on that, both the content and the underlying philosophical ideas. They may also be on one specific axiom in a theory rather than a whole theory. So they are ontological differences at the axiom level. There are also different modeling styles, or the differences in encoding. We'll see an example of that later. Different approaches, basically. And then there are several issues that are actually caused by various logic limitations. And they may be logic limitations causing conflicts that in the end will affect the whole software ecosystem. For instance, if you are working within OWL and what you want is beyond OWL, to be able to resolve it is to change the ecosystem and go, for instance, to the distributed ontology language or a first order logic system, such as Prover and Maze or something else. But you have to abandon a whole ecosystem of tools to actually resolve it. There also may be logic limitations by design for the purpose of scalability, when you have either a very large ontology or you have loads of data, basically. So let's just give an example of the latter, what that actually concretely would mean as an illustration of basically the source and identifying it. There is a sample requirement, plausible one, at least. For instance, you have a COVID-relevant medical ontology for information systems that should not exceed the L2EL profile to represent your ontology. You may want to say that because you want to have compatibility with OBO, that is fairly similar to L2EL. SNOMED CT in medical ontology is represented in L2EL, and it is good for scalability. Now, so if we look then at, for instance, the CIDO ontology for COVID-19, unfortunately is not in L2EL. An example here is given with the class expression with the universal quantifier on the right-hand side, which is disallowed in L2EL. But how would you know? I mean, how are you going to find that out? It's basically being able to having algorithms to be able to detect those kind of violations with respect to the requirement that you have specified. In this case, we do have a tool, actually. I have a screenshot here on the next slide, and at the URL there at the bottom of the page, you can download it and install it in Jar file. When you load the ontology, in this case it's CIDO, instead of looking for the needle in the haystack, basically what it does is burning the haystack so that the needles reveal themselves. You see that there at the bottom, profile violations. We just click the L2EL tab and it shows us which are the axioms that violate a specific profile, and you can click on each one to just see which one it is. So the cannot pun, you can ignore that there was something imported, annotation assertion issue. It is not an issue with the OWL itself, basically. But that gives, it is basically a way to be able to detect it. So now we know where the source is, and we have an algorithm to be able to detect it. We don't have it solved yet, but at least they are like an example of the first two steps in that kind of framework for resolving conflicts. So further, what we have also in more detail in the paper is that we have started with something what we call a library of common conflicts. They can be conflicts at, for instance, the theory level, such as the Buffo and Dolce, as I mentioned before. There are a couple of other common theories from a philosophical ontological side that we already know, and examples are given there on the right-hand side. that can also work out further in the paper. The thing, however, you could say, well, look, we can easily figure this out. So you can say, well, look, we're just using an existing foundational ontology. Likewise, for the language issue, that was number 4 on the previous slide, we just use an existing ontology language. But that is actually, unfortunately, just a case of kicking the bucket down the road, because then the question becomes, how are you going to choose your existing foundational ontology or your language? And then we still have the same question, what if it conflicts with the rest of the system? So actually taking just an existing one that is there on the shelf is actually not solving your problem just yet. We need additional tools for that. Here is an example of one, specifically for the foundational ontologies. It's also available as a jar file and as an online version of it as well. You have a set of requirements that you want for a foundational ontology or specific theory that you adhere to, or that you want to adhere to. You can answer any number of questions that you want in the tool. You also can skip some. You can click an explain button, and it gives you a tweet size version of an informal description, necessarily imprecise because of the small size, but it gives an idea of what we're talking about then. You can do that for each of those tabs or skip a tab. In the end, you submit the answers that you have given. It will compute the results. What, given your requirements, would be the foundational ontology that best meets your requirements. In this case, when I did the example here, I also made sure that I clicked at least one that will actually have a conflicting answer, what you see here at the bottom, for instance, the multiplicative approach that conflicts with BFO, and that is, in a way, we have an algorithm and a tool to some extent, not just to do the meaning negotiation, but in a way, the conflict resolution, in the sense that we are able to identify the conflicts, which are then going to feed in how you're going to manage proposing a specific solution for that. It is slightly different with the language. We can do that simple or complicated. A simple purpose-oriented guidance are, for instance, some of those decision diagrams. If that still results into a conflict, you can use translators such as OBU to AL, and you could even go from OBU to AL, from AL to first order logic if you would want to go first order logic. Other options related as well if you want to keep your original ontology language, and then you can use the distributed ontology language as a glue to be able to piece that together. You also can do it complicated way. You can design your own language. If I had enough time, I would mention something about that too, but in the rest of time, I'll just refer you to our Voice 2020 paper that gives some more information on that. And a point, in a way, OBO itself is interesting because it was community developed. For this audience here, however, I would like to rather give an example on modeling style, because I've seen quite a few different styles being used in the various bio-ontologies that are, for various reasons, developed the way that they are. And so let's just illustrate that here with a modeling style example, and trying to integrate two ontologies, the CDO and the CODO. They are both COVID-19 ontologies. So CODO has something that is called a laboratory test finding, and there are 3 options that it can be: positive, pending, or negative. Those positive, pending, and negative, each of them are instances in the ontology that are made into a class. And then you have the one-off construct used. CDO, on the other hand, has a notion of diagnosis, which is ontologically slightly different from test finding, although when you look at CODO, they actually mean the same thing with it. The key difference, however, here is that something like positive COVID-19 diagnosis is a COVID-19 diagnosis. And in this case, this notion of positive, pending, and negative are not instances as it is in CODO, but they are classes. So what we actually have here, besides naming issue and possibly an ontological issue, the key here is with the modeling style example, is that you have a notion of class versus instance. The idea that they wanted to represent was the same, but they used different constructs in the language to get it into the ontology. So what are you going to do then? There is a modeling style difference there. You can say, well, look, we're going to change the Codo to use pseudo style, which is more like an ontological foundational ontology approach for representing things. We also can say, well, no, we're going to change the pseudo more into an applied ontology conceptual data model style to use Codo style instead of classes. We change them into instances. Third option, you can basically call what is in game theory called a joint outside option. You could take a different approach that is also a very applied approach from conceptual modeling style, is using data property of data property or attribute, and using positive, pending, and negative as values rather than as instances or as classes. So that's basically a third outside option to be able to represent it. All the solution options, they all require the re-engineering, and that's why this is not a case of meeting negotiation, but a case of conflict resolution for it. To be able to manage all of this, we have developed what is called a conflict set grammar for recording the individual conflict sets. So basically the set of conflict sets appear when you're trying to integrate, for instance, the ontologies, or when you try to analyze your own ontology. We have omitted here the production rules of most of the terminals. We're looking here at principally at the variables. This is a grammar for specifying a data structure so that we are able to record the conflicts that have been detected, which is a necessary preconditions to be able to actually resolve them. So how that works out, let's just see here as the example, what we had our original use case with the avian influenza in Switzerland. So here's a pretty printing rendering of one of those data structures populated with the content, what actually was happening with the epidemiology ontology and the administrative ontology. So here, you see the variable names for the different components that appear in our data structure. All the rest are then the values populated for those values. In this case, it was that the crew of the matter, and the problem that caused this non-simple error that pop up in Protege for Rolf, was that in the epidemiology ontology, part of was transitive, whereas in the administrative ontology, part of was functional, and it was used in a disjointness axiom across object properties. And that combination is not allowed in AL2. And so that was one of the core issues. And other core issues, not at the axiom level, but at the theory level, is that one ontology tried to use specific mereological theories, whereas the other one was completely non-committal. So this at least gives a way to start structuring what are the conflicts and to be able to record them. And next step then is that we can use that in the process of conflict for the resolution process in the interaction with the user, because we cannot say we're going to self-solve it in this way. It depends on what the user wants, and being informed about what the consequences of the choices are, which choice is being made. So you can read this in detail later. Here, I just want to highlight a few points that in a way you can think of it as a Q&A session with fixed text, what you see here in the black, what you see in the sort of like purplish color, that is the data that is basically pulled from the conflict set. So we're using that specific data to be able to actually do this negotiation stage to get to the resolution stage. Likewise, then what you see, the green text is basically a different data structure. That is a data structure for this kind of conflict. These are the solution options, and it populates then the individual Q&A with the solution data structure to be able to populate that information there. So there are further system requirements on how to be able to get there. We have more of that in the paper as well. I mean, the essence of it is that we have several tools, we have several algorithms, but it still needs to be made nicely usable and user usable and in a way. But we have some of the algorithms and some of the tools that some of them that exist that can be repurposed and have to be given a pretty printing basically. So there's still some work to do that if you're interested in it. So that was one thing on resolving conflicts for the ontologies. Essentially, we have a similar issue with resolving things in implementation with ontologies. And Noura also asked me to say, well, can I say something about that in the case where we're linking ontologies, so basically the knowledge layer to the data layer. And also there, it is a case of trade-offs. You cannot have everything in one system, unfortunately. So we give here two examples of ways of, for different scenarios, different solutions work basically. So when we're looking at connecting the knowledge to the data, we have to find a way, what you see here, there are those vague arrows. How are we going to solve that? How are we going to do that? And there are basically 4 essential possible options to that. On the left-hand side, you see the real AI, purely AI option. When we're linking knowledge base with the data, with the instances, that is what you do in an ALF file. So all the ontology at the T-box level, as well as all the instances, are in the same file. That is a possible solution, but it's not scalable, and we know it. So in that sense, that wouldn't work if you linked the two together. If you have, say, like 100 instances, it's going to choke or it's going to take too long for the reasoning. On the other end, you see K plus D stored as data. That is basically typically in a relational database or an object relational database. And then what you do is pushing the ontology into the data layer, basically, which is possible, but the downside of that is that you lose most of the reasoning, whereas people actually do want to have the reasoning. So the two extremes, they don't actually, in that sense, solve it when you want to when you have a large knowledge base or an ontology and you have lots of data. So there are two in between there. What we call here, as a generic term, knowledge mapping data and data transforming knowledge, which we shall touch upon in the last few minutes here. So the key distinguishing features of varying computational costs. Also here in a case, we have a notion of trade-offs. What do you want? What do you need? So for instance, we see here in the second option, you have a mapping layer, but that is costly, that this one doesn't have, for instance. But transformations as an option also costs. It's not as costly as the mapping layer, but it costs something as well. There are other trade-offs. For instance, what queries do you want to pose to the data? So for instance, the second option only have SQL, a fragment of SQL, whereas on the other ones here on the side, you have SQLP and SQL, which are full SQL. So you can do anything with that option as you can do for the traditional databases, for instance. So giving an example of the knowledge mapping data, because you have actually a system built with that for genomics for that. And so what you have here in the center, how we're going to solve that with the mapping layer. The idea with the notion of a mapping layer of ontology-based data access is that each element in the ontology, each vocabulary element, is linked to the data with a specific SQL query over the data. And that is specified in the separate mapping layer there. Well, dit is above there with the ontology up there, a controlled vocabulary, a knowledge graph with a pretty picture. There is the logic behind it still. And you can draw that in a knowledge graph kind of notation as well, because you have the logic behind it, so that the graphics doesn't matter too much for that. So then when you have that, you can do your ontology-based data access. That also means you can query that model, the ontology itself, And you do not need to know where that answer, in which database your answer would be stored. It doesn't matter. You do not need to know how to answer the question. You only need to be able, you only can specify that, okay, what do you want out of the database? And the system basically does the rest for you. So that takes away a lot of implementation hassle for that. You have to specify that mapping layer though, and that will take quite some time. So we did that, as mentioned, with horizontal gene transfer, how we had a database. We reverse engineered that into a conceptual data model. We formalized that in Al2QL, which also already gives an idea of, look, the language that you can use is actually very limited. We needed to create those mappings, and then we created a nice interface for that, a web-based one, so they can browse, query, and answer the data through the ontology. You don't need to know, you don't have to touch the database yourself. So here's a section of that that model there. And here's an example of, okay, how does that mapping and how the declaring the mapping actually works out. For instance, you have a mapping ID, you have something that comes from the ontology and an SQL string. That can be a simple one, as you see here. They can be very elaborate and very large, especially the SQL queries, if you need to combine the answer from multiple databases for that. For the interface, we wanted to recreate this ORM notation. The student didn't get that to work, so he came up with his own graphical elements. They have a semantics there, so it's not just pretty pictures. In the interface, then, what you see here, ontology browser, querying, and results, you had the overall picture, and you just could point and click to select what you wanted to use for specifying a query. You sent a path to the query pane. They're using the same notation, but actually a different semantics behind it. What we could do there is automatically generating the query. So the query, what you see here on the right-hand side, the user didn't have to write that. The system automatically is able to generate the query for itself. Then this query is sent to the mapping layer. The mapping layer automatically translates that into an SQL query that goes to the database and then fetches the results. So in this case, it was an example for the Neisseria, retrieving the genes of Neisseria, for which horizontal gene transfer was predicted. Oops. Yeah, so the thing is, with this OBDA, currently it works even better. They have been working on it in the last few years. It's more elaborate and more robust. If you're interested in it, I would say have a look at the paper by Calvanese on EPNet. It's a nice entry paper into the topic. And it's a nice topic about food in the Mediterranean. If you're interested, people do research in that. The downside of this approach with the mapping layer is it's cumbersome to construct and maintain. So when you have defined it and specified it, you actually do not want to touch it, and you just hope that nothing changes in the system. The other one that I mentioned was a low expressiveness for ontology languages, and there are the limitations on the type of query. So we came up with another approach for that would solve these kind of problems. So we have our picture here again with the flower. Instead of doing a mapping layer, we have an intermediate model, which is called the abstract relational model, that we actually transform it into. And just like with OBDA, you can do a different picture there that looks a little bit more knowledge graph-like, because we have a formalization behind it. So that counts just exactly the same. The key, however, is, as you would see here on how the overall architecture looks like, is that we have a notion of our knowledge layer. They're the sort of like the red-brown color there, and the data layer, data management in blue. And instead of the mappings, what we do is a series of transformations. And we can do those transformations on the fly. That can go from your ontology. If your ontology it changes regularly, you automatically can push that through the inferences over the data in the database, because you have a series of transformations. The algorithms are there, and part of it is indeed implemented. Likewise, if your data changes that has an effect on the ontology, you can push it back. So it is basically a bidirectional way that you can do that. So in that sense, it's much more dynamic and flexible to change in a way. There was more on that, but I see that I'm already sort of like close to running out of time, so I'm going to have to wrap up. There's more to the knowledge and information management layer. You can swap between different notations. There is already a tool out there. You can do the automated reasoning for it. The querying is with full SQL and an extension to that makes the queries, basically the formulation, shorter for that. For that, I will run through the notion of my conclusions. What we went through very quickly is that we looked at basically this notion of trade-offs and resolving conflicts when you're designing something. In this case was the ontologies and information systems for where ontologies are being used, and it's a subset of that. We looked at foundational steps towards a framework that can deal in a systematic way with modeling conflicts through the notion of conflict resolutions, of which I gave a few examples in the presentation. There's more in the paper. We use also the notion of a conflict set with a specific data structure to be able to manage that, and have a first steps towards this notion of a library of conflicts that you will know upfront where conflicts can arise, so you also may be able to use that to preempt them. There are several supporting tools for conflict resolutions. More are mentioned in the paper. A few of them appeared here during the presentations. We probably can use more of those ones. And I closed off briefly with certain system design trade-offs in connecting the ontologies to the data. And more of that could be used as well, and that will help people choosing what kind of architecture suits them. You always can invent a scenario that will work for one architecture and approach and not for another. So each one is, I would say, optimized for a specific usage scenario for that. Some collaborators, obviously, because I didn't do all of this work on my own. The references that you can have a look at. And then thank you very much for your attention. I'm over to questions and have a little bit of self-promotion here. As mentioned also what Cesar said at the start. I do have a textbook on ontology engineering. I will say, though, however, that it is aimed at computer scientists, so like a third year, fourth year, or master's or PhD, rather than end users. It is freely available for download, and you can buy it also in hard copy from Amazon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. You blown my mind. Impressive talk. I have some questions, but I'm wondering if Cesar has some question that he would like to bring. Otherwise,
Well, I think we can give space to the audience.
Okay, so Tiffany is very excited as well. She has a lot of questions. So I'm going to start from the first one. So she is wondering what attracted you, Maria, to ontologies and ontology development.
So I completely stumbled upon it. I was doing my honors project in 2003 on bacteriocins. They are food additives. They are chemicals that bacteria produce, specifically in the fermentation, that ward off other bacteria, and then you don't have to put in artificial preservatives into the foodstuffs. And I was modeling that for a database, and there was a component of the bacteriocins that had to do with genes. And then I was thinking, should I model something about the genes? And then I was searching the web. And when I was looking at, I entirely stumbled upon the gene ontology. And I was like, wow. Like, this is cool. And yeah, so then I did more. That was my entirely just Googled, well, okay, I'm not sure it was Googled then, but a web search, and I stumbled upon that, and there was more modeling about that. I'm not the only one who's trying to build a database doing this modeling for microbiology, genetics, genomics, etc. And then I wanted to know more, and then one thing led to another. That's how that's how I came into the Bio-Ontologies.
You get a trapped. You get trapped. I understand. So to go to the next question, we have 5 minutes. I'm not sure if Tiffany could make the questions by herself. I think it would be nice also if we can listen to Tiffany. In Zoom, we can do that, but I'm not sure if with this kind of. Otherwise, I will do. So Tiffany is asking, in your experience, what is the most difficult stage of ontology development, and what's your favorite development stage?
The most difficult stage? You're saying the most difficult stage of ontology development? I still would say it's the modeling, how to get it right in the ontology. And what is it really that you have to model, and how to do it in the best way, and what really does mean the best way. And I know that I have several papers on being certain pedantic things on how to represent it the most best way. I know that, because we want to have the high quality. On the other hand, I also know that some people don't see an ontology really as an ontology, but see it as a conceptual data model. I have no problem with that. And then they say, well, look, you just have an all-formalized conceptual data model, and then it's not an ontology. But and then you just make implementation decisions for specific reasons, that's fine. And then you treat it like that. But if you really do an ontology proper, how it was intended, to sit above the conceptual models to solve the integration problem. Because if you make your ontology, push it into the conceptual modeling layer, then you don't have an ontology as a solution to the integration problem. So you want to have your ontology sitting above, being completely application independent, to be able to integrate those different applications. And then if you're really talking about that ontology up there, it's trying to get it in the best way possible, and actually getting it right, rather than getting it useful for the applications. I'm fine with making things useful for applications, but they are separate things there. So yeah, it's still, I'd say the difficulty is the getting it right in the ontological layer up there. And the second question again was?
Your favorite development stage.
Favorite development stage? I don't really think I have a favorite development stage. There's certain things that I'm not really interested in. So there.
That's also. I would say that maybe it's more useful.
I wouldn't say there is one specific stage. There are several components that I'm interested in. I like the reasoning. I like the feedback that people give, and to be able to develop methods and tools such as TDD Onto. That what we have there is like, before you add the axiom, you can test if it doesn't run into a problem, for instance. Those kind of things, they are like really at the nitty-gritty detail. They are very interesting. Likewise, the work that I did with Zubeida on which foundational ontology to choose. All of those methods and methodologies are interesting, but there are certain aspects, for instance, the learning an ontology from large amount of text, it runs in so much problems. And it's like, okay, yeah, that fine, somebody else can solve that, and I'll take the output of that. I'm not going to go into there. So there are a few components of the knowledge acquisition that I'm not interested in. There are other components of the knowledge acquisition that I am interested in, such as with the DDON method. When you look at all of those biological models, they are fairly structured. They have a legend. They are structured. You can use that to be able to populate an ontology. So those kind of things I am interested in. If you look at the knowledge acquisition, there's certain components that, yeah, you have to make a choice. And there are some things that I like more than others, but there's nothing that I would say I like the most or that I like the least. Yeah.
Let me ask you my own question or a question. So I was attending Voice last week, and I think both conferences were kind of overlapping, and my feel was that there is not a lot of collaboration between ontology developers and domain users. At least it was my impression. What do you think about it?
Yeah, for Voice, they don't really care about the domain ontology developers. Yeah, I think this Voice was the first Voice where there actually was a proper session on domain ontologies. There was one on ontology showcase, was on the domain ontologies, and there was one on domain ontologies. And it is the first time I would say that it's as much applied. If you want to meet ontologists who care in that sense about the domain experts. At least I got the feel that you mentioned something, indicated something like that.
Yeah.
I would say ECAW is a better venue to go to and to consult. EKAW, the Conferences on Knowledge Engineering and Knowledge Management. And there is much more interaction there than between Voice and the domain ontology developers.
Okay, but my question was more on, is a common practice domain experts work in collaboration with ontology developers, or is not?
Yeah, so I think in the end it's the only way to get your ontology developed properly. There are very few people like me who have done several degrees. The microbiology that I have done, but most people have only done one specialization, and they are expert in one thing, and not in the other. So if you have somebody who's an expert, and you cannot really expect the ontologist to truly become the expert, so that you would not necessarily know that person has encoded in the correct way, that it is ontologically right from the domain expert viewpoint. And also, I think you cannot expect the domain expert to become a logician or an expert model in that kind of modeling. And you need to learn something from both. Both need to learn something to get an overlap, to be able to communicate. But yeah, unless you have studied both properly, then you need to collaborate, basically.
Yeah, it was. In fact, it was at ISCBO that one of the talks, the special recommendation was to do this interdisciplinary collaboration between the domain experts and the ontology developers to make more proper ontology that is useful for ontology. So that blew my mind, and yeah, thank you. And Tiffany, welcome.
Hello.
Hello.
I got special permissions to speak, so sorry for not speaking up sooner.
So if you want to yourself ask your questions, please do.
Are we okay on time I could prioritize if not?
We are running late, but maybe one question, yeah.
Hi, sorry to interrupt. The schedule is open. I have nothing going on, so take as long as you folks need. This is a really interesting conversation, and I'm glad it's happening.
Okay, thank you so much.
I feel like that's the beginning of a bad joke. Like, how many ontologists with going overtime at a conference or something? But perfect. Then I will ask one, and then you just let me know if you want me to continue, Daria. I was really excited to see your slides on test-driven development with respect to ontologies, and especially the stages of ontology development. I was just curious if you find different types of traditional software testing to be useful in this process or not, and if you do, what specific types of tests do you think could be useful?
So that there are a few papers around there. So, but for the TDD, what we tried really is the spirit of the TDD, the test-driven development, that you have specify what you want, test that it doesn't exist, you modify it, and then you test that it does exist. And then you have the regression testing that your modification didn't screw up whatever you did before on the tests. So that we try to mimic for the test-driven development for the ontologies as well, with the addition basically that for ontologies we have the automated reasoning with it, whereas for software development you have the coding for it. There are other approaches to some extent that does post-testing, or you can use a notion of testing in the notion of validation. So people from UPM have been working on that one as well. That what you start off with initially is something that is called competency questions, that you may have heard of.
Mm-hmm.
And what you can do with the competency question is to translate that either into Sparkle or in Sparkle OWL. And when you have to specify the competency questions, you develop your ontology. Once when you think you're done, you go back to your competency questions, you query them over the ontology to see if they give the answer that they should be given. So that's another way of testing. It's not the philosophy of test-driven development, but it's more the philosophy of the traditional testing where you do in software testing. It's like by software testing, you define at the start your requirements, you do your you develop your software, and at the end, you do your unit testing. In a way, those competency questions, when you query that over the ontology, is in a sense your unit testing for your ontology. So if you talk about like ideas from software engineering being reused for ontology engineering. And there is still some research being done on that to get that pipeline nicely working.
Thank you. That makes me even more excited after hearing your answer. I will have to follow up on the papers in your talk you referenced to specifically with this, so I can get caught up with what you've already done. I apologize for not knowing that ahead of time.
No, that's okay. We can't have read everything already.
Fair enough.
I don't know, Maria, if you have more time to answer.
I'm okay. I made sure I had a late lunch just in case, so I wouldn't sit here.
So I have more questions, but I don't know.
Yeah, sure. If you want to question, sure, why not?
So about the mappings. So there are some. What do you think about doing inferences from mappings, from these cross references in that we found in ontologies?
Oh, sorry. I was thinking the mappings from the OBDA mappings initially. Sorry. So the mappings, you mean between ontologies?
Between terms in ontologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think there are some projects going on that they want to make inferences using these mappings.
Yeah, so the tool like LogMap already does that. It's also in the way how they try to automatically find the mappings. Basically, they do within the algorithm. It does basically a what-if scenario. What if I align this? Will it result into an inconsistency because there is a disjointness up there in the ontology? If there is a disjointness up there in higher up in the hierarchy, it will not propose this alignment because it knows then that it will this alignment will result into an incoherent ontology. That's already baked into the algorithms, at least some of the algorithms for ontology alignment for that. So that is one thing. Another thing with the alignments and the mappings, we had one paper, it is referenced somewhere hidden in the presentation, is the problem if you have, for instance, in one ontology the transformation and the other one has an object property transforms of and transforms into or something. What are you going to do then? There is a notion that you can do heterogeneous mappings, and you can map one specific pattern, so to speak, to another pattern. It isn't practically. It's not, I say, functioning as well, and it's not a cheap solution. So if you want to have a more elegant solution, if possible at all, rather than making an heterogeneous alignments and some concoction with additional algorithms to make that heterogeneous alignment, it may be easier to modify one ontology to make it like the other ontology. rather than making a heterogeneous alignment between an object property on the one side and a class on the other side. But yeah, we have the alignments between those ones, at least for 5 different patterns. And they are, on the one hand, foundational ontology patterns, and the other ones the more applied patterns for the applied representations, on basically to match the different modeling styles, basically. So you can do it, but yeah, I would rather say, purely from a modeling point of view, make up your minds, which, if at all possible, if you can. In some cases, you're not allowed to modify any of the ontologies. You have to take it as is. Then the heterogeneous alignment is the only option. But if at all you can choose, you need to decide which one you're going to choose, on which ground. And actually, there are philosophical reasons and theoretical reasons to do it one way and not another way. So if you take, for instance, the class option, you will be able to represent things much more precisely with more constraints in a more reusable way than if you were to use, for instance, an object property and a naming of that. So yeah, there are theoretical advantage and disadvantage for one or the other, and then you'd rather, if at all possible, make such kind of a decision, which one you want to do, and go with that decision, rather than having both coexist. That's,
Okay, thank you so much. Any other question? So
I have one question. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I remember in the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned the realistic approach versus the descriptive approach that some foundational ontologies use. For example, the realistic approach of BFO and the descriptive approach of Dolce. And at some level, these different approaches are conflicting, right? So if you want to use ontologies for data interpretability, let's say a perfect world where we can interpret all the data that we produce, do you think that these different perspectives can be a problem for data interpretability?
So before I answer, it's not a realistic approach, but a realist approach.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. That's being finicky. So it's a realist approach versus a descriptive approach. On the most cases, for practical implementation, if both assume there is a reality that you try to represent as best as possible, then no. The only places where that can run into problem is that some people take reality with a grain of salt. And obviously then you can run into problems. Or yeah, you have a certain bias that you basically don't care about the reality. And if you then want to integrate, yes, you can get query answers that are plain wrong because you have chosen something that's wrong in your ontology. But both Dolce, even though that the top level structure is slightly different from the BFO, both still take there that there is a reality that you try to represent as good as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Then it shouldn't matter. It matters only for people who just don't care about the reality at all. And then, because then it may be that if you take that philosophical assumption, it may not matter even at the top level, but it will matter at the subject domain level. Because if you don't care about that, then the mistakes largely will be due to what you have in your subject domain level. If you think you have a top level, a core layer of core ontologies, and then you have a layer of domain ontologies, what you have represented there when you don't care about reality will have a practical effect on the databases, not so much what you have up there as top level ontology. We even have, so one of my students, Zubaida, even has an algorithm. We have a tool as well where you can swap the foundational ontology. It does that for you. In a way, from an engineering viewpoint, it doesn't matter too much if you develop the implementation in that regard.
Okay, thanks.